mean? What does it involve? We had one just the other day, COP29. What are the takeaways from COP29? And what is the role that young people currently play or could play in the future of climate action? So we're welcoming both ladies to the conversation, and we're going to start off with you, Shmoy. Shmoy McLean is from the Climate Change Division at the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. And I'm going to ask you, Shmoy, in like 60 to 90 seconds, to introduce yourself and tell us about the work you do. And of course, this is in particular your role within the division. As we welcome Siobhan Brown. We're coming to you, Mr. Brown. So I think I have to give you my microphone. Hang on.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shmoy McLean. I'm the Program Coordination, Monitoring, and Evaluation Officer at the Climate Change Division. And this division is embedded in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. Now, the Climate Change Division is mandated to collaborate and implement climate change strategies within Jamaica. We do this, of course, through our partnership with ministries, departments, and agencies, private sector, civil society, and of course, in interactions like this with the public. Our overall aim is to mitigate against the impacts of climate change, as well as to build resilience against the impacts of climate change.
Thank you. Now, I have two questions coming immediately on that one. And the first is that a lot of this conversation is going to be about COP. What exactly is COP?
So COP is the Conference of the Parties, COP. But just to give a little background, in 1992 in Rio, Brazil, they had an Earth Summit. And from that Earth Summit, they adopted the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in 1997, building on that, they had the Kyoto Protocol. So the UNFCCC, basically, it was to stop humans from interfering with climate change. So building on the UNFCCC, they had the Kyoto Protocol, and then in 2015, they had the Paris Agreement. Now, the Paris Agreement is where it's the first major agreement on climate change, and it sets out where they wanted globally all the countries that are a part of the UNFCCC to limit the temperature to under 2 degrees, and they settled on 1.5 degrees Celsius.
1.5 to stay alive?
1.5 to stay alive.
Okay, so we understand that, and we have heard the term 1.5 to stay alive.
Right.
There's another term that's not as familiar, and that's the UFCCC, which is going to be a part of the conversation in this discussion. What's that?
So the UNFCCC, as I mentioned, is what was adopted from the Earth Summit to look at how we could have a holistic approach to climate change and how we could limit the rising global temperatures that were happening from pre-industrial times. So they realized that if something wasn't done, then we would have devastating impacts. So they wanted all the countries. At the time when it was signed, I think it was 154 countries. Now it's 194 countries that have signed on. So the COP, going back to the COP is an annual conference that happens every year where all the parties, business people, civil society, indigenous groups come together to see how they can have discussions about where we are and what we need to do, set goals for the future for climate change.
And in explaining about the COP, you also mentioned the Paris Agreement in passing. So explain that a little more for us, please.
Okay, so the Paris Agreement. So all these things, if you realize you have the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, every country or the COP is held in a different city every year. And normally there is something that comes out of that city, some agreement, some initiative, some mandate, something. So the Paris Agreement, it was held in Paris, France, And that's where they said, okay, we need to do something. And all the countries globally decided that, okay, we are going to have this global agreement, and we're going to see how countries will come up with initiatives to limit their emissions, and they will try and build resilience to get this goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Okay, so
So
you
in
are
a nutshell.
In a nutshell, and
Yeah.
you're in the Ministry of Economic Growth, Job Creation,
Yes.
looking at all of this as well. How are we doing with respect to all of these agreements?
So Jamaica signed on to the Paris Agreement in 2017. And we are at the Climate Change Division, the focal point to the UNFCCC. So what we have done, we have developed what is called a nationally determined contribution. That is something, so each country has to develop a nationally determined contribution or a climate plan. And it states what you're going to do to reduce your emissions and to build resilience. We did an initial one, and then our last one was in 2020, and we're currently developing our second or third, depending how you look at it, NDC, and that will be submitted to the UNFCCC in February 2025. But just to note that the last one we did in 2020, Jamaica was the first country in the region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, to submit their NDC, and I believe we were the 11th in the world. Wow. So we are trying to match that this time around to submit our NDC. We have also developed a long-term emissions reduction and climate resilience strategy up to 2050. And this is another mandated report that you have to submit. And it's basically a roadmap to where we want to get to by 2050.
I love the concept of a roadmap because it suggests different points along the way so that we can consistently measure where we are and how we're doing.
Yes.
I want to go across to a different map, a map of the United States, where Donald Trump was recently elected,
Yes.
and he has said he's copping out of the Paris Agreement. What do you think, what kind of impact do you think this will have on global climate action?
Well, it's interesting because I just came back. We had a delegation, Jamaica had a delegation that went to COP. So the last COP was COP29, and it was held in Baku, Azerbaijan, between November 11th to 22nd. So I just came back on Sunday, and it was interesting because sitting in the negotiating room, a lot of people were concerned about what happened because when the United States would put forward something, people were concerned about whether it would stick. And then COP is it's an interesting place. It's a baptism in diplomacy because you're sitting around these tables with 100 and odd countries, almost 200 countries. You're not negotiating as a country per se. So Jamaica negotiates under what is called the Alliance of Small Island States. So not just us in the Caribbean, but also the Pacific Islands, so Vanuatu, Marshall Islands, Samoa, all of us negotiate as a bloc because you have more power in numbers. And sitting there, there was almost like a push-pull between the developed world and the developing world because the Paris Agreement has something called polluter pays principle, where because we are very negligible when it comes on to our contribution to pollution, to global warming, the developed world who have benefited and who have from industrialization and all of that, they are mandated in the Paris Agreement to pay. And that is where, I don't know if you've heard about a 100 billion target. So that was 100 billion a year that the developed world was supposed to pay to developing countries to help them to build their resilience, implement projects that would help them to, have more renewable energy and so on. And we found that there was a little push-pull because the developed world are saying that, okay, when we signed the Paris Agreement, some countries, some developing countries didn't have a big economy. But now you have, countries like China and so on that they now want to pay. So it caused a little friction, and you asked a question about the US. And within the halls of COP, there were discussions about if the US pulls out, then they would not be in a position to now tell China that they now need to pay. So it's an interesting arena to be in.
The politics are changing. The politics of the whole climate change management globally are changing. And you are correct. It will be interesting to watch. It is an experience that you have had, and we're going to be finding out what it's been like for our other panelists, because this is about COP29 and what it means for the future of Jamaica's climate. I want to specifically ask you about your COP29 experience. Apart from that push and pull between the developed and developing world, do you think climate action is moving in the right direction?
I believe it is, because we are sitting at the table. And once you are at the table, then you have a voice. There are way more work to be done. They did achieve a lot of things at COP. So they did come up with a new goal, a 300 billion goal that developed worlds are supposed to contribute to the developing world, 300 billion a year up to 2030, and ramp that up to $1.3 trillion by 2030. And because, if you just look at what has been happening in Jamaica recently, we have had severe drought. And then after the severe drought, we've had intense rainfall, non-stop rainfall. And then you're driving on the street, you see the damage to the infrastructure. And not just huge things like the road infrastructure, even in your house. You may realize that, okay, when it was hot, you may have cracks. And now you have rain, you realize you have leaks. So it's just something, you have flooding. Personally, if you saw on the news since week, you saw a story about Bangor Ridge, Portland, and there was a breakaway, and the gentleman was taking his heavily pregnant partner, walking her out of because it's one way in, one way out, and walking her to try and get out of the community because he wanted her to be. I know Bangor Ridge is where my mother is from, where my family is from, where I buried my grandmother in 2020 as a result of, COVID. And to know that you are marooned, you don't have access, you don't have access to your neighbors, emergency care, and disruption in education.
And all of that climate change based.
Exactly, exactly. So we sometimes we talk about climate change and it seems highfalutin, but you have to know that all these little things that are happening is because of the impacts of climate change.
Final question for you. That 300 billion you mentioned, is that enough? And would we see any of that in Jamaica? What impact is that going to have here?
Well, climate change is heavily reliant on science. And you have an entity called the Interpanel, the IPCC,
Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
In climate change, it's a lot of acronyms. So the IPCC, they have done their studies and they have said we need that amount of money to mitigate against climate change. We do get funding because there are two main entities under the UNFCCC platform, financial study. You have the Green Climate Fund. We are the Climate Change Division again, through the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, is the national designated authority to the Green Climate Fund. We have gotten a lot of projects funded through the GCF. We have also had two entities accredited to the GCF. So instead of us going to the GCF now for money, the GCF would give them and we go straight to them. So for example, the Jamaica Social Investment Fund has been accredited and the Development Bank of Jamaica has been accredited. And the DBJ is doing a blue-green facility, implementing a blue-green facility, and they hope to get $200 million US from the Green Climate Fund, and then to use that to get an additional $300 million to fund that facility. So we do benefit from these funds.
Thank you.
You're
Excellent context from which to move across to Madame Swaby. Now, Dana Lynn Swaby is a global yardie podcaster and many things. But let me allow you, Madame Swaby, 60 seconds. Give us an idea of what you do.
All right, thank you, Paula. My name is Dana Lynn Swaby, and I consider myself a development communication specialist because of the field within which I work. I have over a decade's experience working in climate and environment initiatives and supporting sustainable agriculture. And my passion, of course, having the gift of gab. I'm a podcaster. I have a podcast called Global Yardie, which captures conversation on climate and environment issues at the intersection of culture and sustainable development with people across the globe. So yes, here in Jamaica, in the Caribbean, and in international spaces with the people that I interact with.
Now, that gift of gab and those interests and your training has taken you across the world. Now, you didn't go to COP29, but you have been to COP. You went to 25, you went to 28. What are some of the interactions that you had with persons from other countries that, well, not just countries generally, but particularly small island developing states like ours that stand out in memory?
Well, the Essence Small Islands, I think, speak to the similarities. And even Shmoy spoke to it with her experience being a negotiator, being in the rooms that we can't access because we're different badges at COP, but nonetheless, we all get together. But it's the same thing. And that's why Jamaica, being from the, as part of the Caribbean Small Island Developing States, will be in the same block as countries in the Asia Pacific, because it's a similar context where we're small, we're vulnerable, and even in the economic context, we also are under-resourced as it relates to implementing defenses or protecting against or reducing the vulnerability. That's the string words that they normally use, how we reduce climate change. But even in the Caribbean, which I'm happy to see through my experience, because when I started out, I'm not saying I was the first, but my early experiences, I'm used to being the only person in the room or one of few from the Caribbean or from a small island state. But as the issue of climate change becomes more important, as the impacts are even more obvious and detrimental to everybody, whether it is that you have a technical role or you are organizing at the community level or experiencing it as an individual, we are realizing that we are in different boats, but it's the same storm. So if you're from Trinidad, if you're from Barbados, we all have that same context. Climate change, levying critical impacts to our key economic sectors. So even in the Caribbean, our socio-economic sectors are the same. Agriculture, tourism, and all those experience the same kinds of vulnerability. And it's the same for the Pacific Islands. Sea level rise, or coastal cities, and the defenses that we need. So when we come together in conversations, we realize that aside from the cultural exchange and the country experiences, there are similarities. So what it helps us is to strengthen that collective voice for advocacy and for awareness and the critical mass that you need in any kind of movement to bring attention to what you're going through and to also to press and to agitate for change. And know when I'm listening to Shmoy, from her context, her role as a negotiator, very critical. It's really tedious, locked in those rooms, trying to get developed countries to really listen and to apply in the text, even though I don't think we're seeing it sometimes, the kind of urgency. But in the other spaces as well, there is opportunity for collaboration too, coming together through different NGOs, advocacy groups, youth groups, recognizing that the shared experiences also contribute to the exchange of knowledge where we have gaps in individual countries and so on. So it's really a very mixed and important and impactful bag.
I love how you are in the middle of those conversations. That also makes you the perfect person to explain something that, based on what you're saying, it sounds like is one of the topics that's discussed, loss and damage. Now, we know what the individual words mean, but in this context of climate change and us as small island developing states, Explain loss and damage for us.
The other day, I was also talking about loss and damage, and I was trying to find an analogy. And I don't like to invite doom and gloom, but the reality of loss and damage is almost like we're gone by the morning, can't come with the evening, which means that loss and damage speaks to the negative consequences of climate change that go beyond what we can respond to. So it's unavoidable, it's irreversible. And so climate change, responding to climate change is categorized two ways. We talk about mitigation, which is a very important context why we're here for the JPS Expo. And that speaks to actions that reduce or curb greenhouse gas emissions. Because it's the greenhouse gas emissions that cause global warming, and global warming induce climate change. And we're seeing the droughts, the increased temperature, the stronger hurricanes, the more frequent hurricanes. And so that's mitigation, the steps that we're taking to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Adaptation, very important, especially in our Jamaican context or small island context, is how we reduce the vulnerability. What you do so climate change don't affect you as bad. So you're in areas that are affected by drought. It means then about water storage. So I know I'm going a little bit granular, but just to paint a visual pictures as I possibly can. And so let's take Hurricane Beryl, one of the more recent occurrences. When you speak to loss and damage, it speaks to even though you're trying to protect and reduce how hard hit we are, there are some things that are out of our control. She mentioned a personal experience about being being from a community where she had members of her family, that have passed on. In some communities, because of sea level rise, I think there's a country in the Pacific, their burial plots have gone. So that speaks to non-economic loss, cultural loss, personal loss. So even in extreme weather events, you have loss of life, so that's human loss. The economic impacts that are so far gone, that puts us behind. If you think about an under-resourced country, we have to, I don't want to say struggle, but it's still a challenge to be supporting the key economic sector and also prioritizing human needs and our social protection structures. And each time you're moving forward and trying to provide more for your population, here comes a natural disaster that sets you back. And so loss and damage speaks to those consequences, whether it's economic, non-economic, it's cultural loss and identity. And so there's layers to the very deep impacts of climate change that even when you're putting in measures, there are some things that you just really, it's outside of your control.
So how important is it then for us in Jamaica, small as we are, developing as we are, to be able to access funding for loss and damage?
Very, very important. I was part of another conversation that I was advocating for when we come to the negotiating spaces at COP, when we are engaging with international development organizations and funding organizations. Countries like Jamaica, we don't need any more loans. We need grant-based. And why it's such a struggle and tedious time at COP negotiating, it's because the bigger countries like the USA, the Saudi Arabia, the Russia, the China, these are the emitters, the big emitters. But then it's the Jamaica, it's the Barbados, it's the Samoa, it's the Vanuatu that's bearing the brunt of the impact. There's a country in the Pacific that is uploading their information in the metaverse because sea level rise is happening and they will disappear. So they're being forced to migrate. Imagine Jamaicans being forced to leave Jamaica because Jamaica go underwater. That is a reality for some countries. But even locally, while it may not be that extreme, I'm from St. Elizabeth, one of the food-producing regions in our country, and we even know I am trying to support my community in providing relief for Hurricane Beryl. When you have farmers and the agriculture sector, the tourism sector that's impacted by climate change, it means then that we need increased funding to build resilience, and we're talking about long-term resilience, and so it's always a call for money, which means that when we come to the table and different dialogues like COP and other international conferences, we have to be leveraging our connections and putting forward the evidence-based impacts of climate change so that the powers that be and the persons with that kind of economic power do understand that it requires long-term support, decisive action as it relates to how we're going to get the access to finance and what it will mean when it comes to the shores of Jamaica as well.
And clearly, from what you've been explaining, we understand what it is we have to face as small island developing states, and then the importance of something like a COP, where you both have explained how we are sitting together at the table with the bigger countries, and therefore the opportunity is there for our voices to be heard. So we want to move to a gentleman who is helping to have voices heard, the voice of the youth in particular. He is the Pan-Commonwealth Coordinator for the Commonwealth Youth Climate Change Network. Siobhan Brown, give us a minute where you explain what all of that means, please.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. So the Commonwealth Youth Climate Change Network is one of 12 Commonwealth Youth Networks that is supporting the work of the Commonwealth Secretariat with the initiatives of climate action, in supporting resilience, and in working with young persons to increase their capacities to represent, to carry out initiatives, and to also influence other young youth leaders to be evangelists of the good work that we do.
All right. Now, you also are a, what do I call, an experienced copper. Tell us about your experience at COP28.
To choose the words, I'm not so fond of speaking about my experience at COP28. That's because I was very disappointed about what I saw. As an environmentalist, we are working in this space. We even study COP. To finally get there, and I'm thinking about contributing, I really realized that it was a big expo. So whilst, yes, so there's the expo version of COP as well as the actual negotiations that Shimor would have been a part of. So if you aren't a part of the country party and you don't have that right to be in the delegation, in the negotiating room, then you're really just browsing the different pavilions that are there, accepting as much information that you have or can get, and also networking and sharing with other persons. So it was a very good experience. I did learn a lot, especially for the work that I do in mangrove rehabilitation, because the work that they are doing in Dubai is way advanced, and I was able to capture some of that information and bring back here in Jamaica.
So tell us then about COP29. I hear you were a part of some of the side events.
Yes, I participated remotely. We had events at the Commonwealth Pavilion as well as the CARICOM Pavilion, but one of the major work that I want to highlight is that we had a youth statement that represented the voice of the Commonwealth youth, where we really made a declaration as youth of some of the activities that we would want to do, some of the help that would need, whether it is assistance to reach the global platforms, whether it is human material, whether it is human resource materials or other paraphernalia needed to assist us in the work that we're doing, because it's doing the work underground where we are, it's very rough, especially in Jamaica, one of the countries that feels the brunt of climate change the most. It's difficult because when we go out there in the field, it's hard to tell someone that the way they've been doing a particular task for all of their life is not the right way. And then we also have to show them the right way, which is very difficult, very costly, and they may not see the results, but based off the interaction, based off the work that we've doing over some years now, I can tell you that Jamaicans are accepting what's happening. They're a lot more knowledgeable, and they are a lot more cognizant that they are contributing to what's happening.
So you're talking about general awareness in the population. You mentioned a youth statement, but we know how these statements go. Sometimes it's 5, 6 young people that get together and put that together. And now I'm not accusing or suggesting that that was the case. I'm using it as the basis of a question. Do you think Jamaican youth are involved enough in this effort?
No, and that's the truth. Growing up in the environmental space, I've only seen very few faces. One of the faces right here, Miss Sweeby, worked a lot together. Eleanor, she's here, and I can literally see all the faces in climate change in the benevolent society right now. And we go out there with the resources, we go out there with the help, we go out them and tell them that come to our event, we'll feed you. And yes, and it's really just the same person. So I have to wonder, where are we going wrong? But we aren't going wrong. Where the issue is that in Jamaica, as it relates to youth, there was always this gap between the resources and who the target audience. Now, with the pandemic, what it really did was just increase that gap. So we are just really just working even harder to bring those persons within our reach or within our scope.
And what do you think needs to be done to help you with this effort to engage more young people so that they can have the conversations and have a place at the table? I mean, we heard that the tables that our parliamentarians or decision makers or government entities and representatives have. What do you think needs to be done to give youth that kind of voice that makes a difference?
We really need to increase their sense of purpose. We are really going to be the generation that takes over. In any society, the youth are the largest demographic, which means that we should really be bringing the youth to the table and to the initiatives. Let them do the actual work. Let it is that when we are able to save Helsha Beach, we can look back some years from now and said, we did work together as a group to collectively ensure that the next generation can experience what it has to offer.
Thank you for that. Social media has sent in a question, and you may decide who would best answer. How in danger are we of having set emission and other international climate targets too late?
How important is it for?
How in danger are we? Is it too late? Here we are scurrying around now like chickens without heads or ants who have disturbed the nest. Are we too late?
I don't think we are too late. The 1.5 might be a little out of reach, but we are still trotting ahead. The national determined contributions that are supposed to go in next year, those are commitments made by countries, and it's supposed to be scaled up from the one that was submitted in 2020. You're supposed to show how it is you're going to drastically, since the last one, cut your emissions. I mean, we're here, I'm sure in 2020 when the last NDCs went out, we didn't have something like this. We didn't have all these EV vehicles coming in. You didn't have all the solar panels. I saw a really good story in the paper when I was at COP about, what was happening at Walmer's group of schools. And, they had these solar panels and how much they've saved and how the money that they've saved, they're inputting it into technology and science and to help students to further develop so that in a few years, those kids now can go out and even ramp up more, develop more infrastructure, more implements that can be used to ratchet down the temperatures that are rising. So I don't think it's too late. But I'd also want to comment on some things that my other panelists had mentioned. So you had mentioned something about loss and damage. At COP28 in Dubai last year, they did implement the loss and damage fund, and that has now taken off. They hope to issue the first set of money, I think, next year or by December. They have a home now. It's going to be housed in the Philippines, and they have a head. So we do have a loss and damage fund because they realized that they couldn't mix loss and damage with adaptation. It's something completely different. So there is a positive in that one. And as it relates to the youth, when you mentioned what can be done, he was registered under the Jamaican delegation. So we do encourage the youth. We've worked a lot with Dana Lynn. We've worked with Eleanor. Eleanor has been there forever, and Eleanor is now a part of the CCD embedded, helping us to write bankable concept notes, to get more funding, to build resilience. So another thing that we do is that we have a climate change advisory board, And we always ensure that there's a youth representative on that climate change advisory board. So within the MEGJC, within CCD, we are doing our part to kind of empower the youth. And anytime we have anything, just a plug that we're going to have a post-COP event in January, I think it's the 20th of January. And that is an event where you will hear more about what happened at COP and where Jamaica plans to go to ratchet up its climate ambition.
I love it. We're hearing a lot of things happening from what she called the MEGJC, Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation.
Yes.
And you are the perfect person to ask our final question, because you're sounding positive. How are you feeling about that future of climate change, especially the advocacy with Jamaica? How are we looking?
On one hand, I'm optimistic about what is happening. About even in the negotiating room, there's a lot of young people that are now leading the charge. That are the older ones they've tutored them, they've held them under their wings, and they're still there. But you have a lot of young people who have this gusto. And if you follow the climate finance, the NCQG, there's a young guy called National Collective Quantified Goal. And that's the target. The NCQG is the target where they already did the 300 billion. There is a young guy called Mikai. What's Mikai's last name? I can't remember Mikai's last name. But no, not five. But he's so passionate. And he represents AOSIS. And when you hear him speak, and then he has this hairstyle, it kind of reminds you like Malcolm X. But when you hear him speak and negotiate, and he's so passionate about the future and where we are as AOSIS and small island developing states, and he's letting the developed world know that, listen, this is not a joke for us, this is what we're living.
So
and
you have hope.
we have hope.
You
but
are...
I'm also a little scared because I think you did say, and it is true, we need to move fast. And we need to take it serious. And we need the developed world to understand that this is our lived reality. A lot of times when we have to write these climate projects, they ask you for the climate rationale. Why do you need these funds? And we're like, we need these funds because we're living it. Yes. Just look at what happened in Grenada. It's not something that we're thinking about that's going to happen 10 years from now. It's happening now, and it has happened.
Understood. Dana Lynn, the scene is set. The movie has started. You have the protagonist. I don't know who the star is in the movie, but does this climate change movie have a happy ending?
Paula, that's asking if I can see the future, and I don't know. But as always, there's never a night or problem that can defeat sunrise or hope. And so when I want to also add another perspective when we ask about youth engagement. Youth always represents hope. So while some young people may not necessarily be in specific climate organizations, it's intersectional. I just stopped at the Climate Studies Group Mona booth and I saw a lot of young people there, young scientists. That's important. And so we have the eco-entrepreneurs, we have the environment lawyers as our young people, we have the organizers, Girls Care Jamaica, through them and the networks that they've introduced me to. I was able to mobilize $1.5 million in support for post-hurricane barrier relief. And so not all young persons may be a part of a Jamaica Climate Change Youth Council, may host a Global Yardie podcast, but because of the intersection of climate change impacting every aspect of our lives, when you can empower young people to pursue whatever vocation that they want, once they see the connection, we're all working towards a collective goal. And so to answer that question in the matter of intergenerational equity, when we think about the old versus young and everybody coming together, it's going to be hope as long as we continue to understand. So some people, like the negotiators, some of them set in their ways. It's the youth that we need to understand. She said they have gusto. They don't care. They're agitators. So let's hope that then when they evolve and no longer become youth, the mission is still the same for them. And perhaps we'll get closer to the goal. We're more aggressive with the goal and not using terms like transition away. We're phasing out. We're cutting. We're curbing. We're being more decisive.
Thank you, Dana Lynn. Siobhan, Dana Lynn has described a scene in the movie where we're having ground swell. Is that energy enough to change the tides? How positive are you about our future with climate change?
I'm very positive, very optimistic. Just feeling the rewards from the work that we're doing. I remember working in the Portland Bight protected area. That's a Ramsar protected site in Old Harbour Bay. And when we are in the area, the fisher folks they weren't so welcoming. The other members of the group in the community, they weren't so welcoming. Fast forward 6 years from now, I can tell you that we have tangible results in the mangrove population, in the fish population, in how the community is just accepting us when we arrive on the weekends to collect data and to do our sensitization workshop. So with just that as my example, I'm very optimistic that if we continue the work that we're doing, we will feel long-lasting results.
And that's an excellent way to end. I love that note. I can see the credits moving up the movie screen and smiles on the faces with that kind of perspective. I want to say thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. And those of you here with us, can we please give our panelists a round of applause? We've had Shmoy McLean, Dana Lynn Swaby, and Siobhan Brown as we deep dived into COP29 and the future of Jamaica's climate. Thank you.